The notion of dividing commonly refers to everyday acts of sharing food, sharing spaces, distributing tasks. In common sense, sharing is done out of generosity, solidarity, or compassion. However, upon closer analysis, especially from the historical materialist philosophy of Karl Marx, the division takes on a radically different character. Sharing is not a simple moral choice or gesture of goodwill. It is a structural requirement in the face of the contradictions inherent in the capitalist mode of production. Dividing from this perspective is a historical imperative for reconfiguring production relations in forms of property. It is about breaking with the private appropriation of the means of production, the primary cause of inequality, and establishing a logic of sharing guided not by charity, but by social justice. In other words, Marx does not propose that we share the fruits of capital. He demands that we share capital itself, or rather, that we extinguish it as a private instance of domination. Thus, to understand why division is necessary, it is necessary to delve into the fundamental categories of Marxist thought: historical materialism, class struggle, alienation, surplus value, and the critique of private property. This text aims to delve deeper into these categories and demonstrate, with philosophical rigor, that the need to divide arises not from an idealistic utopia, but from the very internal logic of the social contradictions of capitalism. For Marx, it is not ideas that shape the material world, but the material world that shapes ideas. This reversal of Hegelian idealism marks the birth of historical materialism, the foundation of Marxist thought. According to this conception, the economic structure of a society, that is, the way in which men produce their existence, conditions its legal, political, and ideological superstructure. Thus, institutions, laws, and even moral ideas are ultimately expressions of the interests of the dominant class, derived from the material conditions that this class imposes. The idea that division is necessary can only be effectively understood when seen in the light of this structure. The concentration of the means of production in the hands of a minority, the bourgeoisie, is not a historical coincidence, but a product of capitalist economic logic. In order for some to accumulate, many must be expropriated. In order for there to be concentration, there must be deprivation. To divide, therefore, is to subvert the order imposed by the economic base, demanding a superstructure that reflects collective interests and not just the interests of the holders of capital. In this sense, the struggle for division is the struggle against the ideological hegemony of private property and limitless accumulation. Private property in Marxist analysis is not an extension of individual effort, as liberal ideology argues. It is not, in essence, the natural result of a person's merit or work. On the contrary, it is most of the time the appropriation of what was produced collectively through the exploitation of the labor force of others. In the work The Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels categorically state, "The abolition of private property is the sum total of communism." This does not refer to personal property, but to the ownership of the means of production, factories, land, banks, natural resources. This private property inevitably generates structural inequality. It concentrates economic and political power in the hands of an elite, while condemning the majority to economic dependence. In this logic, division means destroying the bourgeois monopoly of production and reverting control of the means of production to the collective, to the working class. It is therefore not a question of sharing the profits of capital, but of abolishing the structure of exploitation that produces them. Only in this way can a truly free society be established, in which production is guided by human needs and not by profit. Surplus value, a central concept in capital, is the mechanism by which the capitalist extracts surplus value from the worker. The worker sells his labor power for a salary, but during his working day, he produces more value than he is paid. This difference, surplus value, is appropriated by the capitalist, configuring the essence of exploitation. Now, if wealth is generated by collective labor, why do its fruits belong to a few? This is the question that Marx poses against the naturalization of inequality. The non-division of the means of production generates the non-division of wealth, and with it, the perpetuation of misery and exclusion. In this case, dividing means reversing the legalized theft of surplus value. It means giving workers back control over what they produce. It means transforming the production process from a mechanism of domination into an emancipatory activity. The fight to end surplus value is, in practice, the fight for the fair and rational division of the fruits of labor. Alienation, as Marx develops it in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, is the condition of the worker who, when producing under capitalist logic, finds himself separated from the product of his work, from the production process, from his own essence, and from other human beings. In this system, the worker does not work for himself, but for the profit of another. What he creates becomes strange, hostile, an instrument of his own submission. He does not recognize himself in the world he builds, because everything he produces is appropriated by another. Division here is necessary to overcome alienation. By collectivizing the means of production, the worker once again recognizes himself in what he does. Work ceases to be a compulsory activity and becomes an expression of human freedom. To divide is therefore to rehumanize work. It is to remove from the production process the destructive character that it assumes in capitalism and transform it into a space of creation, encounter, and fulfillment. Only in a society where the means are shared can man find himself as the subject of his own history. For Marx, the history of all societies that have existed to date is the history of class struggle. Masters and slaves, nobles and serfs, bourgeoisie and proletariat. The conflict between oppressors and oppressed is the force that drives social transformation. Division in this context is not an ethical appeal to the dominators. It is a practical imposition by the dominated class, which upon becoming aware of its exploitation, organizes itself to break the chains. The division of the means of production will not come from concessions by the oppressors, but from the revolutionary action of the oppressed. The necessary division is not only economic, but political. It requires organization, class consciousness, and confrontation. The proletariat, by uniting as a historical subject, becomes capable of establishing a new mode of production, socialism, a transitional stage towards communism. Marx never proposed an abstract utopia, molded in celestial ideals. His communism is a real utopia, founded on the concrete analysis of the contradictions of the present. Division is not a romantic dream, but a rational strategy to solve the crises and inequalities of capitalism. In a communist society, the division is not only of goods, but of power, responsibility, culture, and time. It is about building a society in which everyone has access to the fruits of the collective, in which the individual is fulfilled in the social, and the social flourishes from the freedom of each person. Division, therefore, does not mean leveling down, but liberation in its entirety, freeing labor from servitude to capital, freeing human beings from planned scarcity, predatory competition, and alienation. In the light of Karl Marx, division is more than necessary. It is inevitable. It is the logical consequence of the contradiction between social production and private appropriation. It is the path to overcoming exploitation and building a society where equality is not a promise, but a material reality. It is not about asking. It is about taking. It is not about charity, but about conscience. Dividing is not about getting rid of what is one's own. It is about recovering what is common. It is about putting the human back at the center of history. Marx does not invite us to be kind. He calls us to transformation. True division is revolutionary. It demands that we stop being objects of the economy and start being its subjects. Because only when bread, land, and power are divided will freedom cease to be a word and become life.